Imagine standing in a marble corridor, barely 16 years old, wrapped in flame-red silk that suddenly feels too thin. The air smells of saffron and burning cedar. Somewhere behind the veil covering your face, you hear footsteps too many footsteps, and you realize with cold clarity that the room you're being led toward contains more than just your husband. The door opens. Lamplight spills across faces you've never seen. An elderly woman in ceremonial robes. A man holding leather implements you don't recognize. Servants with basins of steaming water. And in the corner, draped in linen cloth, something tall and wooden that everyone else seems to understand but you. Your mother's hand shook this morning while braiding your hair. You thought it was sentiment. Now, as the woman in robes takes your wrist with a grip that allows no escape, you understand it was warning. Within the next hour, you'll learn why Roman brides wept on their wedding mornings. Within the next hour, you'll discover what the marriage contract truly purchased. And within the next hour, every assumption you held about love, choice, and what it meant to become a wife will shatter like dropped pottery on stone. This isn't legend. This was marriage in the Roman Empire, a ceremony so disturbing that ancient writers refused to describe it openly, and later Christian scholars tried desperately to erase it from history entirely. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It absolutely fascinates me that a story buried for nearly 2,000 years can reach someone sitting exactly where you are right now. The year was 89 CE. Emperor Domitian ruled from a palace built on paranoia, and 18-year-old Livia Tertia was about to learn that Roman marriage had two faces. One wore flowers and sang in sunlight. The other waited behind locked doors, witnessed by strangers who might one day be summoned to testify in court about everything they saw. The day had started beautifully, almost hypnotically so. The procession through Rome's streets felt like moving through a dream painted in orange and gold. Livia wore the flammeum, the flame-colored veil that marked her unmistakably as a bride passing from one household to another. Her hair had been arranged before dawn in the ancient style, parted with a spear point, woven into 6 braids, bound with wool ribbons that scratched against her scalp. Every detail followed rules older than anyone could remember. At the temple, the augur had read favorable omens in the gleaming organs of a sacrificed sheep. Her father spoke the archaic formula, transferring her from his legal authority to another man's control. And she had whispered the words every Roman bride spoke. Ubi tu Gaius ego Gaia. Where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. An oath declaring she no longer belonged to herself. Her new husband, Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years her senior, had met her exactly 3 times before this day. The law didn't require affection. It required witnesses. The crowds lining the streets had sung the traditional Fescennine verses, crude, sexually explicit songs meant to entertain the gods and ward off evil spirits. Young men shouted suggestions through her veil that made heat flood her face. Her mother had promised her the songs were harmless, protective. But Livia had seen her mother's trembling hands that morning. She'd heard the sob her mother tried to muffle, and she remembered the final whisper against her ear. Don't resist. Whatever they ask of you, don't resist. Fighting only makes it worse. By the time they reached Marcus's house, the last daylight had died. The doorway was garlanded with greenery and wool, 2 blazing torches marking it as a place where a marriage would be legally consummated. Someone threw walnuts at her, a fertility blessing that felt more like mockery, shells catching in the folds of her dress and stinging her skin. Marcus lifted her across the threshold to prevent the bad omen of stumbling. But the gesture had older roots. It echoed a time when brides didn't enter their husbands' homes willingly. The door closed. The singing outside became muffled and distant, and Livia finally saw who had been waiting inside. An old woman in ritual dress, the pronuba, whose job was to supervise every moment of what came next. A priest of uncertain affiliation, 3 female servants holding basins and folded linen, an older man carrying a leather bag of medical instruments, and in the corner, half hidden beneath draped fabric, a wooden structure nearly 4 feet tall. The pronuba stepped forward and took Livia's hands. Her grip was firm enough to prevent flight. "Welcome to your husband's house," she said. "The sacred rites must now be fulfilled." Very few people speak honestly about what Roman marriage actually was. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't a union of souls. It was a transaction, a legal transfer of authority, witnessed and documented as carefully as the sale of land or livestock. Under Rome's oldest laws, a wife passed entirely into her husband's power in manum, literally into his hand. He had the same legal authority over her that he had over his slaves, including, theoretically, the power of life and death. By the early imperial period, when Livia crossed that threshold, the laws had softened on the surface. Women could own property. Divorce was possible. Some forms of paternal authority had evolved, but the foundation remained. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's legal control to another's, and like all major transfers in Rome, this one required verification. Think about how Romans handled land sales. Witnesses attended. Rituals invoked divine blessing. Boundaries were inspected and walked. Documents were sealed. Nothing was assumed. Everything was proven. Romans applied the same logic to marriage with one brutal modification. The property being transferred was a human body, and that body's ability to produce legitimate heirs was the asset being purchased. So Roman law required both the bride's virginity and the consummation of the marriage to be verified before the union was considered valid, not assumed, not trusted, verified. And the rituals designed to accomplish that verification, the ones Livia was about to face, were ones that very few ancient writers dared describe explicitly, because even in Rome they were considered unspeakably private. Livia stood trembling beside the veiled wooden structure, unaware that what happened next would be burned into her memory for the rest of her life. A ritual so disturbing that later generations would try desperately to pretend it never happened at all. Roman law was uncomfortably explicit on one point. A marriage didn't exist legally or socially until it was physically consummated, and it wasn't enough for the husband and wife to simply claim it happened. There had to be proof, observation, sworn testimony. Without witnesses, the entire marriage could be challenged. Without verification of the bride's virginity, the legitimacy of future children could be questioned. For Rome, that ambiguity was intolerable, so the Romans created rituals that made perfect sense within their legal framework and feel horrifyingly incomprehensible within ours. The pronuba tightened her grip on Livia's arm and guided her toward the veiled structure in the corner. Livia's heart pounded so hard she could feel its rhythm in her throat. She knew that whatever stood beneath that cloth would change everything about her life, her body, her understanding of what marriage meant. what being a wife required, but there was no path backward. "You must honor Mutinous Tutunus," the Pronuba said quietly, her voice calm but her fingers insistent. "You must ask his blessing before your husband can approach. The gods must witness your submission." Livia swallowed hard, her breathing shallow. She had never heard of this god before. She had no idea what honoring him truly meant. Her hands shook as she reached for the draped cloth. The witnesses leaned closer. Even the servants stopped moving. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. When Livia pulled the cloth away, she understood why. Standing beneath the covering was a wooden figure carved with uncomfortable anatomical precision into the shape of a phallus. But it wasn't a small charm the kind children wore for luck. It wasn't a crude protective figure placed in gardens to ward off thieves. It was deliberate, intentionally proportioned, built for a purpose. And that purpose became terrifyingly clear the moment the Pronuba began to explain. Mutinous Tutunus was Rome's obscure god of initiation and fertility. Ancient writers mention him only briefly, and always with a sense of discomfort, as if even the name felt wrong to speak aloud. Augustine, writing centuries later, as Christianity tightened its grip on Rome, described the ritual with fury and disgust. Roman brides were required to position themselves upon the god's image before lying with their husbands, and they did this in front of witnesses. He condemned the practice, but he didn't invent it. Other early Christian writers referenced the same ritual, suggesting it was too shameful to describe openly. Arnobius claimed brides were forced to straddle the idol while their new husbands watched. Lactantius said that even speaking of it polluted the tongue. Even Varro, a pagan scholar centuries earlier, mentioned brides being presented to Mutinous Tutunus with language that suggested physical contact, though he deliberately avoided details. Modern scholars, uncomfortable with the implications, often downplay the descriptions. They suggest perhaps brides only sat lightly on the statue's base in some symbolic gesture. But the ancient language doesn't support that gentler interpretation. Augustine used insidir, a word meaning to settle upon, to mount. Arnobius's phrasing implied penetration. Lactantius refused to describe specifics at all unlikely if the act had been merely a symbolic touch. The official justification, of course, was fertility. The unspoken purpose may have been something else, to break resistance, to demonstrate submission in front of witnesses, to prepare a virgin bride for what the law required next. Now Livia stood frozen before the wooden god, its grotesque shadow flickering across the wall in the lamplight. The Pronuba moved behind her, adjusting her position, guiding her body, arranging her without gentleness. The witnesses watched in silence. Her husband watched. The physician waited behind them, hands folded, ready for what came after. And in that moment, Livia finally understood the meaning of her mother's trembling warning. The obscene street songs, the secrecy, the fear. She understood what becoming a Roman wife would actually cost. Technically, she could refuse, but refusal meant the marriage contract would dissolve. She would return to her father's house, not as an honorable bride, but as a rejected woman, damaged, untouchable, unmarriageable. She would bring shame to her family. She would become a whisper at dinner tables. Her life as she understood it would be over, so she didn't refuse. When it was finished, servants came forward with warm, scented water. They washed her carefully, murmuring prayers meant to purify her after contact with the god. But the washing had a second purpose, a more practical one. It prepared her for the examination. The physician, who had been watching silently, now stepped forward, and Livia felt her stomach drop. This part wasn't optional either. In marriages involving wealth, lineage, or political importance, Roman brides underwent medical verification before the ceremony. A midwife or physician documented the bride's virginity. Records of that examination could later resolve disputes about inheritance or legitimacy. The texts preserved by Roman medical writers, merciless in their precision, leave no doubt about what the examination involved. That first examination, conducted earlier, established the baseline. It declared Livia untouched, an asset intact as Roman law saw it. Now came the second examination. This one verified that the ritual with mutinous tutunus had been completed, that the physical signs matched the earlier documentation, that she was, by Roman logic, ready. Everything happened with the witnesses present. Their testimony could later be required in court if the marriage was ever contested, and not one person in that room seemed to feel the slightest discomfort about what was being done to her. Modern readers recoil at these descriptions. What feels invasive, degrading, traumatic to us was, to Romans, simply a matter of legal procedure. The bride's comfort didn't enter the equation. Her feelings were as irrelevant as the feelings of a field being surveyed before purchase. Property didn't have feelings. Property was transferred, and the procedures had to be followed. When the examination was finally complete, the pronuba led Livia toward the marriage chamber prepared for the consummation. The room was positioned exactly as tradition required. The bed was placed so it could be easily seen from the doorway, because that doorway by custom would remain open throughout the night. Oil lamps burned steadily, providing enough light for the pronuba to observe without interruption. Servants waited nearby to assist afterward. Everything about the room felt staged, prepared, designed for a ritual Livia couldn't escape. Marcus entered at last. He paused in the doorway, glanced at the watching pronuba, and moved toward the bed. His expression held something Livia didn't expect. Not confidence, not desire, but discomfort. As if even he understood that what was about to happen wasn't an act of intimacy. It was an act of verification, and the night was only beginning. Marcus hesitated at the threshold, and that alone surprised Livia. She'd expected a man certain of himself, commanding, someone who understood exactly what this night required. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the pronuba, as if seeking permission or guidance, a faint flush of embarrassment crossing his face before he approached the bed. The pronuba raised her chin, her voice formal, weighted with ritual authority. The bride is prepared. The gods have witnessed her submission. Let the union be completed according to the customs of our ancestors. Let those present bear witness to the act. Let there be no doubt that this woman has become a wife. Her tone allowed no hesitation. What followed unfolded slowly, hour by hour, beneath the unblinking gaze of those assigned to watch. The pronuba stood watch from the doorway, stepping forward only when tradition required instruction, occasionally adjusting something, occasionally correcting Livia's posture or Marcus's approach, ensuring every element of the consummation met legal expectation. The door remained open. Lamplight spilled into the hallway. Anyone in the household could hear the movements, the voices, the ritual instructions. Every sound was part of the documentation, part of the proof. Nothing about that night was private. Nothing was meant to be. For Livia, The bed linens might as well have been parchment, and her body the ink Roan needed to finalize the contract. Everything that happened was a form of verification, one last step to make the transfer of authority indisputable. By dawn, the air felt thick, the lamps burned low, and the physician returned. He entered with the same clinical detachment he'd shown earlier. His task was simple: confirm that consummation had occurred and that Livia now bore the physical marks expected of a woman who had crossed from virgin to wife. His examination was recorded. The pronuba gave her sworn statement. Witnesses nodded in agreement. The legal transformation was complete. Livia Tertia, barely 18, was now officially a Roman wife. Her status, her identity, her future all reconfigured in a single night. She would go on to bear children 4 over the next decade. She would manage her husband's household, host dinners, supervise slaves, perform religious duties, and carry herself with the dignity expected of a matron. To the outside world, she would appear composed, capable, respectable. But about her wedding night, she would speak to no one, not even her own daughters. There were no words for it, and truthfully, she'd never heard another woman speak of theirs either. Livia's silence wasn't unusual. It was universal. Women of her world didn't record these experiences. Men didn't document them in personal detail. The rituals were so deeply embedded in the fabric of married life that describing them would have seemed redundant, like explaining sunlight or breath. Everyone already knew, and yet no one spoke. This is why historians today struggle to reconstruct what really happened behind closed doors in ancient households. Much of what we know comes from fragments. Angry condemnations by Christian writers, scraps of legal commentary, passing references in medical treatises, archaeological evidence, whose meaning becomes clear only when placed beside these scattered texts. The absence of detailed accounts isn't evidence of concealment. It's evidence of familiarity. The rituals were the water Roman women lived in so omnipresent that describing them felt unnecessary. For nearly 1,000 years this was marriage in Rome. Generations of brides walked the same torch-lit paths. Generations of mothers whispered the same warnings. Generations of young women endured the same night, the same witnesses, the same scrutiny, the same rituals that transformed them from daughters into wives, from people into property, whose value was measured in heirs. The system persisted because everyone, men, women, families, priests, accepted its logic. Property had to be verified. Legal transfers required witnesses. Marriage produced legitimate children, and therefore needed proof. Women were the vessel through which family lines continued. It made sense within itself, even as it seems monstrous to us. The end of these practices didn't come from Rome deciding it had gone too far. It came from outside, from the spread of Christianity and the slow transformation of what marriage was supposed to mean. Not a transfer of property, but a sacrament. Not a legal contract requiring witnesses in the bedroom, but a spiritual bond that belonged to the couple alone. Even then, change came slowly. Church fathers condemned the rituals with mutinis tutinus, but other wedding night customs, the witnesses, the examinations, the proof of consummation lingered for centuries in various forms across Europe, sometimes enforced by the Church itself when legitimacy was in question. The memory faded. The records were scattered. The stories went unspoken, until only fragments remained angry paragraphs in Augustine's theological arguments, a passing mention in Varro's antiquarian writings, a furious line in Lactantius about rituals too obscene to name, enough to know it happened, never enough to forget how it felt.